The air in downtown Los Angeles was thick with exhaust and neon, the kind of night where stars were hidden not by clouds, but by the glow of a city that never stopped performing. Robert Downey Jr. sat alone on a cold iron bench just outside a theater he once headlined. A black hoodie covered his face, shielding him from recognition, but not from regret. The premiere he skipped tonight was his own. Another Marvel sequel, another standing ovation. But Robert didn't care anymore. Fame had become a costume he wore too long. Applause felt hollow, success sterile. His phone buzzed again. Missed calls from his agent, his assistant, his son. He turned it off. His reflection on a store window stared back, eyes sunken, soul tired. That's when a low voice interrupted the silence. "You look like someone who lost a war he never signed up for." Startled, Robert turned. A man in an orange janitor uniform stood nearby, leaning on a mop, wiping sweat off his brow. His name tag read, Jason M. Robert narrowed his eyes. "You always walk up to strangers with poetic insults?" Jason chuckled. "Only the ones wearing $900 sneakers while trying to disappear." Robert blinked. This man had seen through him in seconds. Jason shrugged. "It cleaned floors, not people, but broken is broken." "I recognized the look." Robert didn't reply. He didn't need to. The silence between them was louder than words. Jason sat on the edge of a planter. "Want to hear something strange?" he asked, eyes fixed on the pavement. "I used to be a high school English teacher. Shakespeare, Baldwin, you name it. Then life happened." Robert raised an eyebrow. "And now you mop theater lobbies?" Jason grinned. "And sometimes I talk to ghosts in hoodies." Robert smirked, but it faded quickly. He looked down at his hands. "You said broken. What makes you think I'm broken?" Jason leaned in slightly. "Because only broken things sit outside the spotlight they built." The night had settled into stillness, but something between Robert and Jason stirred the air, like a conversation neither had prepared for, but both desperately needed. Robert tilted his head. "You said you were a teacher. What happened?" Jason didn't answer right away. He studied his hands, rough, calloused. Divorce, debt, a daughter I couldn't provide for. School budget cuts gave me the final shove. Janitor work pays the rent. Sometimes. Robert's chest tightened. The words hit closer than he wanted to admit. Jason turned to him. "What about you? You look like someone who has everything and nothing at the same time." Robert looked away. "I've got everything people want, and none of it means anything anymore." He paused, then added, "I don't even know who I am when the cameras stop rolling." Jason nodded slowly. "That's the thing about masks. Wear them too long, you forget there's a face underneath." Silence again. Then Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny folded paper. He held it up, but didn't unfold it. "I wrote something years ago, back when I still believed I could change lives with words. I keep it to remind myself who I used to be." Robert stared at the worn edges of the paper, oddly drawn to it. Jason offered it. "Want to read it?" Robert hesitated, then took it, unfolded it. Inside, a single line in faded ink. "Some men act to escape their reality. Others speak to rebuild it." The weight of the sentence hit him harder than expected. His fingers tightened around the note. How did you write this?" Robert asked. Jason simply replied, "Because I lived it." The words on the note lingered in Robert's mind like an echo he couldn't silence. Some men act to escape their reality. Others speak to rebuild it. It felt as though someone had peeled back a layer of his soul. He handed the note back to Jason, but the man just waved it off. "Keep it," he said. "Might mean something different to you tomorrow." Robert tucked it into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the silk lining of a life he no longer felt he belonged to. "You were a good teacher, weren't you?" Jason gave a half shrug. "Some kids still write me letters. That's how I know I mattered." Robert looked down. "I don't think anyone writes me anything real anymore. Just scripts, endorsements, numbers." Jason smirked. "Fame doesn't come with friendship. It comes with contracts." That line, "it comes with contracts," rattled something in Robert. He thought back to award shows, champagne toasts, hollow applause, and the one person who used to tell him the truth, his brother. They hadn't spoken in years. Jason pulled a small thermos from his coat. Coffee. Cheap but strong. Robert accepted it without hesitation. He sipped and winced. "That's awful." Jason chuckled. "Truth usually is." Robert laughed too, for the first time in what felt like weeks. Then Jason asked something that pierced deeper than expected. "If the cameras disappeared tomorrow, who would you be?" Robert didn't answer, because he didn't know. The rain had stopped, but Robert stayed. His $1,000 shoes were soaked. His publicist had called 5 times, yet he ignored it all. Instead, he sat beside Jason, reading poetry out loud under the city's gray breath. For the first time in years, Robert wasn't acting. He was being. As the hours passed, something began to unravel inside him. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just quietly, like a knot loosening at the end of a rope. "I used to draw," Robert said, almost to himself. "Before acting, before fame, I sketched people on buses, old men at coffee shops. I loved it." Jason smiled. "You still can." Robert looked at his hands, the same hands that once held pencils before they held scripts and golden statues. Jason stood up, stretching. "Come with me." They walked through narrow streets until they reached a mural-covered wall. Jason pointed at a faded section. "This is where I paint. Or try to." Robert blinked. "You're an artist?" Jason shrugged. "I paint pain. Helps me survive it." Robert picked up a can of spray paint. His fingers hesitated. "Go on," Jason said gently. "No one's watching." And in that moment, Robert let go. He painted. Not for money, not for critics, not for followers. Just for the feeling. Each color became a memory, each stroke a confession. And as he stepped back to see his messy, raw, imperfect creation, he smiled. It wasn't beautiful, it was honest. And for Robert Walker, that was enough. A week had passed since that rainy night. Robert hadn't returned to his mansion in the hills. Instead, he checked into a modest apartment in Koreatown. No assistants, no paparazzi. Just silence and sketchbooks. Each morning, he walked the same route, past the wall where he had painted with Jason. He'd pause, smile at the chaos of colors, and move on. But on the 8th day, something felt off. The mural had been finished. Jason's brushstrokes had transformed Robert's chaotic start into a breathtaking portrait. Not of fame, not of pain, but of peace. And under the painting, a name was signed. J.H. Robert froze. J.H. Jason Harlow. He turned to Google. Nothing. He called a contact at a veteran's shelter. "Any record of a Jason Harlow?" After a pause, the voice replied, "Sir, Jason Harlow died in 2019. Suicide. We named our outreach program after him." Robert couldn't speak. His heart raced. "But I met him. I talked to him. He was real." "Sometimes," the voice said gently, "the ones we need most find a way back to us." That night, Robert returned to the mural and stood in front of it for hours. Tears streaming, hands trembling. and for the first time in his life, he whispered to the wind, "Thank you." Later that month, Robert made headlines, not for a film, but for opening a foundation in Jason's name. The JH Initiative, mental health support, housing, and art therapy for homeless veterans. During the launch, someone asked him why he chose that name. He smiled and replied, "Because once, a stranger saved me. Not with money, not with fame, but with a brushstroke of truth." He paused, and his name was Jason. As the cameras clicked and the lights flashed, Robert looked past the crowd into the sky. Not every miracle comes in daylight. Some arrive under rain. Final quote, Robert's words. Sometimes the ones who've lost everything teach us what truly matters.